Okay, after a week off, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. It's been a busy day, Thomas, in the league. It's been a busy day at Sumer. I'm, we're 11 weeks in. We're already now into the second head coach who's been let go by his franchise. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm good. I can't wait to dive in. I mean, this has been a whirlwind. I hope our listeners are in that mode too. It's like it's fired up without having a whole bunch of Red Bull, which is kind of crazy because it's all initiated by all the news. I mean, Carolina and a firing like at this point. What are your initial thoughts on it from where you are? I mean,
yeah, it's certainly after 11 weeks, it somewhat surprises me. I figured that they would give Reich the whole season. So that one, because I don't know if there's anybody on that staff who's really kind of like that person in the wings. You remember in 2010, the Dallas Cowboys fired Wade Phillips and went with Jason Garrett. Jason Garrett was kind of always thought of as that next head coach, possibly for the Cowboys. So then they kind of debuted him middle of the season when they were struggling and kind of gave him the reins for the rest of the year. And then he went on to coach that team for 8 or 9 years after that. In Minnesota, when Brad Childress was let go, Leslie Frazier was given that job and kind of pushed through there. There are succession plans that I think oftentimes make sense and is why, you would let go of a coach in the middle of the year. The Panthers brought in, Josh McCown, who a lot of people really like. They brought in Ejiro Evero, who a lot of people like from Denver. It's kind of curious to me that Evero, for example, wasn't given, or he didn't want, reports were, the Denver interim job when that happened in 2022. He got passed up for this interim job as well, Thomas, for Chris Tabor, the special teams coach. Jim Caldwell, the former head coach of not only the Indianapolis Colts, but the Detroit Lions, is now kind of in that assistant head coach. He's kind of consulting with Thomas Brown, the play caller. So I have a hard time with a mid-season firing when you're not really in playoff contention, so there's really nothing to salvage in some ways during the middle of the year, and B, you don't necessarily give that interim job to a guy who you're sort of trying out, right? This is when you give that job to Chris Tabor, you are saying we're going to have another search next year. And if that's the case, I don't know why you just don't run out the string with Frank Reich. That's like kind of the one thing that I'm puzzled by.
Wow, there's so much in those comments and always good, thoughtful comments, of course, on your side. I put myself in that spot and I think, okay, first of all, my mind goes right to Scott Fitterer, right? Like, where is Scott in all of this? How is he dealing with this? He's a good friend and I appreciate him, but I mean, untouchable, right? The last thing you want to do is bother someone like that when things get really, really heated and dusty. Okay, you have an owner who is brilliant, right? He's brilliant. You guys have talked about him. He went to, what school did he go to? He went to
well, I don't know if he went to Carnegie Mellon, but I know that he is very involved there. There's a building named after him there. So, to your point, anybody who's made $1 billion is pretty bright, so there's an element. There's an element to that.
Yeah, he's obviously very smart. And if you read Mike Florio's piece today, I mean, he got really, really aggressive with his thoughts about David Tepper and his approach. And I think he's got that feeling, at least Mike Florio does, about a lot of owners, right? Some owners, and at least the newer wave of owners who are more involved in organizations. That said, again, let me come back to Scott Fitterer. As a GM, please everyone understand this. I mean, something like that happens. Of course, you're looking at yourself. You're looking at how you're supposed to manage through all of this, right? You want to be positive enough and not be down in the dauber, walking around with your head down, of course. You have to be smart. You're expected to be a leader, even if you don't know what what the long range plan is. You have a lot to do. You're supposed to still be every day, for the most part, communicating with your owner. Your owner is going to be asking you all kinds of really, really interesting and detailed questions about your coaching staff, who you should let go. So like you have usually as a GM, you have a really good relationship. You're supposed to in today's world with your head coach and the staff. Now the head coach leaves. Now your loyalty as a GM has always been, no matter how close you are, it's always been to the owner. Your owner, that's where your money comes from. It's where your bread is buttered, so to speak, right? And now the owner's asking you for a lot of really interesting information. What do you think about this coordinator? What do you think about this? What should we do they just fired their OC, right?
Yeah, they fired Josh McCown as well as Duce Staley.
And Duce Staley as well, yes. Josh was the quarterback coach, right?
Yeah, Thomas Brown's the OC. He remains the OC, and now he's calling plays. Reich was calling plays, then gave it to Thomas Brown, then took it back, and then was let go. And then now Thomas Brown is back in the play calling.
Right. But think about how complicated this is as a GM. Yes, this is why you're paid all the money you're paid. Because now when you've been really friendly with everyone, trying to keep everyone's morale up, now your owner, for the most part, is asking you more than likely, what should we do, GM? Who should we let go? Who should we keep? Who should we go with? That is not an easy situation to be in, but that's what is expected of you. Now, all of a sudden, you have coaches walking around the building who are wondering, is the general manager on my side or is he not on my side? It's a really, really interesting phenomenon.
Well, and maybe you could shed some light on this because obviously you let go of Mike Smith. Now, the difference, of course, was in 2014, you guys were playing for the division title in week 17. So there was never a time when Mike's team was more or less out of it the same way that the Panthers are right now. But that's like the question I have, whereas like you have everybody in the building that's having a really hard time with kind of deciding which side is which, right? And for like the rank and file inside of an NFL building, that can be difficult. And I don't necessarily know that after you break the seal here and get rid of Frank, does that how much more of an eval? Because I think, like, look, if you're somebody like Tepper and you've made your money in hedge funds, you've made your money based upon information and betting on that information and all of this, right? The next 7 weeks or 6 weeks are about gaining more information about your team so that you can move forward in a constructive manner. That's the one question I have about letting Reich go, because it's like, I don't know if letting Reich go gets you closer to that aim, if that makes sense, right? Because people are nervous, people are kind of like on eggshells. The players don't kind of know. There's always this interesting part of it, right? And so that's like the weird thing for me. Maybe you can shed some light on what that's like, because obviously you were a part of letting Mike go after the season, and so it's a little bit different. But like, what is that like?
Wow. I mean, look, David Tepper, as we mentioned earlier, brilliant man, has been massively successful. He's in a world here in sport right now where he's trying to decide on how he wants to approach things. His soccer team, I think as he let go of 2 or 3 coaches there, I think.
It's been 4 coaches in the last 18 months for both of his teams.
So he's got strong opinions. He's he's not afraid to make tough decisions. We see that. So, I mean, that's a solid thing for an owner, right? To know that, and I'm not going one way or another on this. I'm just saying it's not easy. There could be some owners out there that don't want to go down that lane, and all of a sudden they just delay and delay and delay. He's decided to move forward on this. He obviously has some strong plans about what his next idea is going to be, right? Does he go out there? Does he make a move, potentially for Bill Belichick, if Bill were ever to be available, or what other coaches are going to be available? Or is he going to go with a young, inexperienced coach? I mean, where is he going to go that way? I think that is one of the things that is going to be fascinating in this, to watch, again, a guy who's very, very smart, doesn't have a ton of experience, doesn't have 20 years in the NFL, of course, but to see how he navigates this. Who is he going to tap into that's going to help him with the selection process? We talked about this before. David Tepper right now has a lot of work to do with his selection process, right? Is he going to have a group of people? Is it going to be including Scott Fitterer and Samir within their building? Who's going to be involved? Is he going to go out and get a third party that's going to help him locate the next best? Where is the Fritz Pollard Alliance going to be involved in this as well? Rod Graves, great friend of mine. Rod, is he going to be tapping into Rod and make sure that he is, of course, making sure that he knows everything about the underrepresented opportunities out there, which he has to do and which would be very, very smart for him to do. So there's a lot playing in this, right? And then they're also thinking about where are they going to be picking, right? Oh, by the way, do they have that first pick?
No, and that's where it gets really hard, because I think the narrative now, because let's shift gears. Like I don't want to make a value judgment on the Reich. I'm more wondering about, when does it happen? If the owner, it's the owner's train set. So if he wants to fire the coach, he can fire the coach. Like there's no, and frankly, Florio's an interesting dude, right? Because he built a platform on Pro Football Talk that all of us, when I was, just a high schooler, would read every day. He's certainly plugged in. He's got a lot of opinions. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of his opinions, but he's well sourced, all that kind of stuff. And so he's got his axe to grind there. I have a little bit more.
Can I say I think Mike Florio's really, really good. I do. And I'm only saying that because, but I don't, when I read his, again, his diatribe today, I have to step back and separate myself, because Mike is a really bright person and he's got a lot of really strong opinions. Again, you might have had your own dealings with him. I'm just saying he's got really good insight. Mm-hmm. This aside, because I don't want to get in the middle of this, I think it's important to your point. This is not a value judgment. There are a lot of people out there slamming the decision. I think we can take this in a more academic approach here, because this is not an easy decision to make. It's not an easy decision for the owner to make. It's not an easy decision for the GM to be in the spot. And what about the players? And oh, by the way, how are they going to build their team moving forward because they don't have the first round pick? I would love to stay there. Not to change your.
Yeah, I just want to, I have a little bit more empathy for the owner, in the sense that this is your team, and there's a little bit, I understand. I think a lot of us would have a hard time being hands off with the team if we owned it. You know what I'm saying? I think that I think we all say, okay, let everybody, I think what it does is it gives, I think about, for example, the Hunts in Kansas City. I think about the Wilfs in Minnesota. I think about Lurie in Philadelphia. I think the way in which they handle ownership, where they're involved, but they're not, but they let people make decisions. I think that is, I think we expect that. And I don't think we necessarily look at that and say, wow, that's actually probably really hard to do, right? When you own this team and you're letting other people, and obviously Arthur with you, there's a lot of internal, what I would say, self-control in hiring people and empowering people. And I think that we're a podcast, we often talk about leadership. I think that that's something to take a step back and be like, instead of looking at Tepper and being like, oh my gosh, this is one thing. I think we look at some of the owners in the league and say, how is that modeled? How is thoughtful yet empowering ownership? I think that that's something we should look at it positively, as opposed to, looking down on somebody like Tepper is kind of my view of it. And maybe more, and this guy's still only owned the team for 4 or 5 years. And whereas a lot of these other guys, Lurie bought the Eagles in the 90s, and, and this thing is built into what it's built into. It doesn't happen overnight, is kind of my point.
You sent something a little bit earlier from someone else. It wasn't obviously your comments, that was referencing, basically in general, was talking about hedge fund individuals, right? And they're so dialed in on successes and exactness, right? Do you want to expound on that a little? I thought that was fascinating. And it's not fair for us to mention that. I don't know. This was a comment from someone with an inside source, right? But let's talk about the bigger concept here. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I just think that there's coming from a sports betting background, I can kind of see both worlds, where in trading and in finance and in sort of more traditional businesses, it's a little bit different, right? Because you get to apply your faculties over and over and over and over and over again. And so if you have an advantage, which most of these guys do, right? And our, Paul PTJ, the guy that owns Sumer, our founder and co-founder and chairman, like, you get to see your edge demonstrated over and over and over again, and it builds up over time. And I think that football, unfortunately, in some ways, but I think fortunately in other ways, because football's romantic. It's a game. It's 17 weeks a year. But you don't get to see that, right? Everybody going after you about Julio Jones back in 2010. They're looking at historical models. By the way, I'm going to write this article during draft time. I think that the process of looking at draft trades is a little flawed, and I think your situation was one of the reasons I re-looked at it. But like, they look at it and say, okay, if you trade up to 6 1 million times, you're going to end up losing 53% of the time and winning 47% of the time. But the fact is Thomas Dimitroff doesn't get to trade up to 6 1 million times, right? And so, and football is a collection of one-off applications, and trading and a lot of the ways in which some of these guys get into football is not. It is literally 1 million different trades or 1 million different bets and so on and so forth. And so I think that that's a disconnect in the sense of we apply the law of large numbers to certain things, and then we try to apply them to football, and we get left with our hands up because we're like, well, the game is changing, right? So, and how fast is the game changing? How much is it changing? How do you measure success, right? We were talking earlier today internally about, like, how do you measure the success of a draft grade? Well, you probably have to go back in time and do it, but like, that takes time and effort, and all of that time and effort, Thomas, is longer than David Tepper's owned the Panthers. Mm-hmm. So, we're looking at, and the quote, and I have to read back at the source, but the quote was essentially, Tepper was discovering that success in pro football was more elusive. Teams were lucky to hit on 3 picks in a draft. Free agent acquisitions sometimes didn't work out, and the reality didn't sit well with Tepper, according to a front office source. And I get that. Like, I understand that in the sense of, you only get 7 draft picks a year, and only 3 or 4 of them really matter. The 5th, 6th, 7th round picks are kind of coin flips, we all know, and they're weighted towards the guy not working out. And you get 1 or 2 free agent signings a year if you're lucky. And so you think about that, Thomas, over the course of 5 years, that's not that many decisions. And yet they're all under a microscope every single day. And the difference between somebody being good and somebody being bad is, in the case of the Panthers, sometimes just which quarterback works out, which we all know is a mystery. And so I just find it incredibly, in some ways, it's empowering because it means that there are human elements to it, and there's an art to it. And yet I think at the same time, it's frustrating in the sense of you can build the best models in the world, and the probabilities can still land the wrong way for you.
Let's factor in this as well, which is really, really important. Back in the day when Bill Parcells was the head coach of the Super Bowl champion New York Giants, he made $50,000. These owners right now are paying unbelievable amounts of money, 7, 8, 9, 10. Some of those guys, like the best of Bill and Bill Belichick and Sean Payton, those guys are 18, 19, 20, or whatever they are, right? These owners are saying nowadays, hey, look, I'm not paying these guys a couple $100,000. I mean, I feel they don't have the same worry like, this guy's going to be out on his porch without money. These guys sometimes, I mean, I'm sure Frank Reich probably had a 4 or 5 year contract. He's got a lot of money coming his way. So I do believe that these owners now are like, hey, if you're not producing, we're not putting wins in the win column, and it's not going well, then we're moving on. So I just feel like there's a little bit more of an understanding that way than there used to be back in the day.
Yeah, and there's going to be less there's going to be less of the familial sort of feelings towards people because, again, Frank Reich has made a lot of money, and David Tepper owes Frank Reich now a lot of money, as do the Colts, although I think there's probably offsets over the last few years. So Frank Reich's not hurting for money, but at the same time, there's still like a jarringness to the whole thing about getting fired and about your life's work being scrutinized, and will you ever get another opportunity again? Will you ever get that thrill? I think that the big thing, and I know, having talked to a lot of people who have been in front offices as well as in the coaching, like there's an aspect of at some point it's more about the pride and everything. And back then you had the pride, but you also didn't have the huge investment, to your point. And so I think now when you pay a head coach $5 to $10 million a year, as an owner, there's probably a little bit less loyalty in the sense of like, well, my loyalty is being demonstrated to you by how much I'm paying you. And I feel less bad about firing you 11 games in because I'm going to owe you that money anyway. And I think that may be one of the disconnects between, sort of the non-football families. You think about the Rooneys, who have only had 3 head coaches. Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin. That's like more of a familial thing, right? Mike Tomlin probably gets fired in another organization, but he's around because the Rooneys are sort of a football family, and it's sort of familial like that. The more, the more financy you kind of get with, and you see this in basketball. A lot of coaches don't last very long in basketball. They're paid very well, but it's more of a transactional thing. And it's the same thing when you think about trading, you think about gambling, you think about all these other things. Back when I bet, like if I took, let's say Minnesota's tonight is -3. If I took Minnesota -3 on Monday, but the information changed on Thursday, I'm going to get off that bet if I don't think it's worth it anymore. I don't have the emotional attachment to the gamble I made in the beginning of the week. And that's, again, like this transactional living, this transactional universe that a lot of these men come from when they buy teams now, I think is going to give rise to a little bit more of the transiency that you see in head coaches and GMs.
Well, you can flip that over. I know we're going to come to the end of this conversation, but Rex Ryan, your buddy, was quoted as saying, Frank Reich looked like he has aged 10 years. And when you see some of these pictures, you're like, wow, you just feel for him, right? And you do. Like you said, no matter what, there's a lot of money coming his way. Everyone in the world would love to have an opportunity to be a head coach in any league, let alone the NFL twice, right? I mean, okay. Yep. But he's still a man. He's still a human. There's still heart and soul into it, right? Everything that I know about him, I don't know him well, is that he is a really good person. No one wants that for anyone, right?
Yeah.
So let's keep that in check. It's just a complicated situation in today's world. And now there's also comments about all the sharks being out there. I'm like, yeah, I get it. Maybe I'm a little bit more hardened to it all after I gotten fired, right? Maybe prior to this, I had never been fired before in my life, before 3 years ago. And I'm thinking, maybe I'll never get fired. And then like that, it happens. That's life. And in professional sports, it is that way. We had a comment today in our meeting, without going into detail about it. And I think I came into that, I was a little bit edgy, and I felt like we were making light of it more than we should. And yet, so maybe I flipped back at a couple of our guys. But the point is, you do care about people, right? You do feel for them. Their families have to go through change. There's a lot.
Frank, from everybody I know in the league, is a tremendous human, and the way that Frank Reich treated Jim Kelly when he was his backup, sure, and the way that he, obviously a legendary performance in the playoffs against the Oilers, coming back from a 32-point deficit in the playoffs. Like, he's had it, but everybody that talks to me about him, Eagles, Colts, now Panthers, although it was a short time there, has nothing but good things to say about him. And so all the messages I got today from the league were all pretty somber as far as him. Again, the harsh way to look at it is no one's going to feel bad about him because he's made a lot of money. He's lived out his dream as an NFL head coach. But I think if you empathize with him for a second, you realize that like he inherited Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck, for no fault of his own, right? Andrew Luck retires out of thin air. He still has a competitive Colts team. for all those years, dealing with a lot of stuff. I think you look back on it, and I think the Frank Reich was more unlucky than anything. And to that point, I brought some data with this, Thomas. The Panthers this season, and by the way, you go to sumersports.com and look up the article this past week that I wrote about luck, penalties, and turnovers, a little work that we did for former Chiefs GM Scott Pioli with the NFL Network. The Panthers were bottom 5 in the NFL in turnover luck and penalty luck this year. So, and a lot of those things are not necessarily that tied to skill. And so, again, I feel like Frank Reich has gotten unlucky in some ways as a head coach. And so, not to make a value judgment, but again, I think that this is a pretty messy sort of situation as far as him and Panthers wanting to move on and all that stuff. And, it makes for interesting talk on a Monday, but it'll be interesting to see what happens to him, where he goes, probably as a coordinator right away. And then beyond that, who the Panthers end up hiring.
Well, the last thing, the Panthers are in a spot where they're at the front, along with probably Mark Davis, to look at potential hires. And, it's time for I'm sure David Tepper to really dig down and see which direction he's going to go and put the right person in the right place. And there are some good ones out there. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, let's review week 12, because you and I were watching a game, not together, but we were like texting during this game. I've always been a purist about the league has 32 teams. There are 8 divisions of 4 teams. I loved when it was 16 game schedule because everything was a power of 2, right? 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It made a lot of sense. Now we have the 17th game, makes it a little bit more messy. It's fine. We have more football. But I've always been somebody that says, no, if you win a division, you should host a playoff game. Even last year when the Bucs went 8-9, I'm like, Tom Brady should host a playoff game. He should. They battled through this season. Bruce Arians resigns mid off season. Tom Brady comes back. They've gone through a lot. Let him host a playoff game. I'm starting to crack, Thomas, and I'm cracking because every week the Falcons are on TV here and the Saints are on TV on the other station usually. Yesterday they played each other. Falcons win, but was that like, I watched that game and I'm thinking to myself, look, they ran the ball well. I thought that they were very tough up front. Patterson ran really hard. Algier ran really hard. Obviously Robinson made a few plays. London, Pitts, they were fine. Ritter threw the ball right to Tyrann Mathieu twice. Beyond that, he was fine. The Saints are the most frustrating team in the NFL. They have a quarterback that should be better than he is. They have Chris Olave, who's a good player. An offensive line that's fine, I guess. Defense has some ball players in court. Matthew, obviously, Jordan. And yet I watched that game and I'm thinking one of these teams is probably going to host a playoff game in January. And I come out of it, with a lot of empathy for you, having gone through the gauntlet of the NFC South back when it was, Breeze, Cam Newton, all the great quarterbacks in that division. Breeze, Cam Newton, Jameis was even like spunky at times. And now, that team that hosts that playoff game is going to be a touchdown underdog in the first round of the playoffs. What was going through your mind when you watched that game?
I just, both of those teams, they have their smattering of players there's talent on their team. Now, New Orleans also, they had some injuries, right? They had a number of injuries, unfortunately. They have their starting wide receiver and their starting corner out. I mean, defensively, I just thought, I was a little bit surprised as things were happening and quite frustrated watching it, not because I was cheering. I mean, of course, I'm not sitting here cheering that way. I'm just looking at a division with 2 teams that have always been unbelievably competitive. One could be up or down, and yet they always came into that game and it was always close, right? That was a pretty big.
A fun fact, you were 21 games over 500 in the regular season as the Falcons GM. You never won back-to-back division titles, and the Falcons are the only team in the NFL history to never win back-to-back division titles. The reason for that is because the Saints and the Panthers were always pretty damn good, and you had to battle to win that division all the time. And now it's insane. It's crazy.
I was just surprised that every time it happened, Carr was moving it all over the field, and then he'd get down into so-called nut cutting time, and it got dicey. And so I think in the end, that's where my head went. I'm like, my gosh, this division right now has so many challenges. And when at the end of it all, I was happy for Arthur Blank, of course. I'm looking up there, and it's good to, Arthur's looking at his team up there in the division. He's right up there, and they bring up all the like on the networks, and they're showing the 4 teams, and there they are below 500, sitting pretty. And I'm thinking it's going to be interesting to see down the stretch, and then Tampa loses, right? There's just that's a really, really interesting situation, how that's going to play out. And is it going to come down to the Saints and the Falcons? Is that what it comes down to?
Well, let's go ahead and take a look at sumersports.com because we can, we don't have to necessarily wonder these things because of our great data science team here at Sumer Sports. Let's go to sumersports.com and look at these, simulation results here. So when you look at the way that I can look at this is by just looking at the strength of schedule metrics, where the Falcons have had the easiest schedule to this point, not all that much different than the Saints have. We give the Falcons and the Saints about equal likelihood to win the division. Falcons slightly ahead at 43.4%. The New Orleans Saints at 41.4%. The Tampa Bay Bucks, if you go down there, the reason that the model maybe doesn't like the Bucks is, well, the Bucks have the 3rd easiest schedule left after the Falcons and the Saints. So that, and the Panthers have the hardest schedule left in the NFC South, the 9th easiest in the NFL. And so we give the Bucks about a 15.1% chance. The Panthers really have no chance of winning the division at this point at 1-10. So that's kind of how it's looking right now, Thomas. I would say I would still give a slight edge to the Saints just because they have a home game against the Falcons in week 18 to avenge. So I think that's in their pocket. They also have a better quarterback. But the way that the numbers look right now, the Falcons have a slight edge, obviously, with the head-to-head win, right? So even if they finish, let's say the Falcons are a game back when week 18 hits, but then they go to New Orleans and win, they're going to win the division based upon sweeping the Saints. So that's why the Saints have a slightly higher projected win total. But the Falcons have a little bit of a higher chance of winning the division title.
I mean,
there's also a sneaky way that both teams could get into the NFC in the playoffs, just because the NFC is a little bit weak, right? You have teams like Minnesota, who's starting quarterbacks out. You have Green Bay, who it has Jordan Love going right now. One of those teams, or the Saints or the Falcons, could win a wild card in that conference.
I think before we move on here, I just want to comment on a couple players. I mean, you mentioned, Bijan Robinson, he is a damn good player. He's got ability to catch and run, all the stuff that we know. The fact that they found him and utilized him yesterday was great, I thought. Yep. And, I think that's an important thing. I also said, I really believe they should run the heck out of it. I've said it, run the heck out of Ritter, because I don't necessarily believe that, Ritter's in that spot where, who knows what's going to happen. Let his athleticism come out, keep people on their heels, right? Run one time, pass it, because he can dart some balls too. Unfortunately, he's had some tough breaks, but I would utilize him however you need to utilize Desmond Ritter to win as many games as you can. That's what I personally would think to do. Put him in a spot, get his athleticism going, let him zip some of those balls in and utilize some pretty damn good talent, as you know. The last 3 first rounders, utilize them while they can. I didn't see Pitts use that much yesterday. Did he have 2 catches?
I believe so. Yeah, he had a couple. I think he's still injured, Thomas. I think that's one where, and honestly, this is a good question for you because you've been in that chair, but you've been in the GM chair, but you've also, you've been very, both of the coaches that you had when you were with the Falcons, you're very complimentary of. I wonder, and maybe it doesn't matter, but I wonder if they don't benefit from just coming out and saying Kyle Pitts is not 100%. He's gutting through it because he's a tough guy. But one of the reasons he's not getting the football as much as you fantasy football nerds want him to is because he's injured. He's not injured enough not to play, but he's not 100%. And so give everybody a break. Is there any benefit in saying that, or do you lose some competitive advantage? Because I feel like at this point, all the teams watch him on film and know that he's a little slower than maybe implied by a lot of the metrics. And so, but Arthur Smith gets a lot of daggers in the media. And I feel like there's a way to curb that a little bit by just saying, look, like, we wish he was 100%. He's not going to be. He probably won't be till the end of the season. And so, but he's healthy enough to play at a certain percentage, and that's why you're not seeing the production. Does that help at all, or does that go against the cause at all?
I maybe feel like it goes against the cause. I don't know if I'd want to share it. I get where you're going. You're going to use your big brain to overthink it and everything. I think the reality is, you got to, I mean, he's still out there playing, right? He came across the middle. I thought he bobbled the one ball through the middle there. I did see that correctly, right? I mean, look, I just think that this team and the rest of that division right now just have to hold on for dear life to see what, who can, and if it's last year, 8-9 won the division, right?
That's right. And the other three teams were 7-10.
Unbelievable. Like 2 years in a row, potentially that's going to happen, back to your point. So hold on, do whatever you can do, get creative, get edgy. And, look, I mean, they have a safety. He's playing his ass off, and he can take it to the house. He's got really good ability to jump on the ball. His instincts are what you're looking for in a safety. The corners are playing solid. They're not many interceptions. They still need to get more sacks, as defensively, but they're a tough ass D. They play hard.
Yeah. Bates had a pick six. To your point about, like, I think the Saints should have won. They were in the red zone up 3-0. He throws a pick six to Jesse Bates, he being Derek Carr. Yeah. They're behind by 5. Or no, 2. It was 14-12. They're in the red zone, and Bates forced a fumble on Taysom Hill, and the Falcons went down and extended the lead with another field goal. The Saints, you look back, having to settle for 5 field goals, but also turning it over twice in the red zone. I still think that they're a slightly better team if you had to power rank them, but you can't step on your toes. You can't. You just can't shoot yourself in the foot in games like that, especially on the road, and expect to win. And especially when your quarterback is a midliner, to use your term. Not that you've applied this to Derek Carr, but I'm using your term. My evaluation of Derek Carr is more of a midliner, and so if you're going to win with a quarterback like that, he can't make mistakes, but you can also make mistakes like fumbling and stuff.
That's right. Well,
yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
Let's talk Buffalo versus Philly. That was a great game. I want to say, I texted you last night during Los Angeles versus Baltimore, and you were like, I got to take a little bit of break. Was the break, Thomas, because you watched that marathon game between Philly and Buffalo? And that game, goes, by the way, every single 3:00 hour or 4:00 hour game should go into overtime so that I don't have to wait that long till Sunday Night Football. That was a very nice of them to do yesterday. But Buffalo again outgains Philly by a country mile. Josh Allen's amazing, but save for one play, interception to James Bradbury. Sean McDermott kind of messes up the end of game stuff with the timeouts and everything. Philly, he doesn't think it's going to matter because the Philly kicker has to kick it from 59 yards in that quandary. That kick by Jake Elliott's a top 5 kick in NFL history, by the way, given like leverage and distance and weather and all that stuff. And so Philly comes out of there 10-1. It never looks pretty with Philadelphia anymore, but they keep winning. The new coordinators, I thought were, especially offensively yesterday, were really good. They came back from a kind of a sleepy first half, but now you look at Buffalo and they're 6-6. They have a point differential of 101 plus, right? So one of the best 6-6 teams of all time. Sean McDermott fires, Ken Dorsey. Joe Brady has another good performance, another 30-ish point performance. And yet Buffalo's still searching for answers. They're way behind. They're way behind Miami. They have the hardest schedule in the NFL moving forward. It's really tough to see a way out for them. I think that the Bills are a classic. and I don't know if you remember this one because it's way back, but they feel a lot like the 1991 49ers, who missed the playoffs by one game. Your Falcons actually knocked them out, and they're considered the best team in NFL history to not make the playoffs. Steve Young won the passing title. George Seiferd's amazing coach, all this kind of stuff. I feel like we're going to look back at Buffalo and think this is one of the best teams that may not make the playoffs in NFL history.
You said a lot there, Eric, and you said it with passion.
I did.
Can I ease in for a second here, or a few moments on Philly? First of all, I wanted to be very outspoken about this because I really do believe that Howie Roseman, the Philadelphia Eagles, my good buddies, Dave Caldwell, who also is one of the main scouts there with Philly, as well as Matt Russell, another great scout that they have there. I mean, I just feel like the years that we won those Super Bowls and that New England won, there were so many things going in their favor, right? Balls bouncing their way. I mean, a 59-yard field goal. You said, I don't know, quandary or something, but you meant quagmire probably, right? Or maybe you didn't. I mean, it was wet. That cat gets up there and kicks it with like just assurance. And I'm just thinking, like, all those years in New England when we were winning like that, it was just, you could just tell things were going in your direction. And I just feel that for them. I feel like they're just in a spot where this is going to be their year to take this one. I know that's jumping ahead of it. I just had to say that. I'm feeling it.
It feels charmed for them. And, they dealt with injuries. Like yesterday, they didn't have Lane Johnson. And his replacement, Jack Driscoll, a guy out of Auburn who I really liked, he gave up one pressure the whole game. I think about all the injuries around the league, and I think about how much injuries tank teams. And here the Eagles, their top 5 player on the team's out. He just plays, backup plays phenomenally. This is a team. I mean, look, they've gotten lucky. Marquez Valdez-Scantling catches that ball on Monday night, and they lose that game. And, but at the same time, you have to – there's what's the drops and stuff, they're not fundamental. What's fundamental is being close to great teams. And you think about Philly last year on the way to the Super Bowl. The Niners were the best team that they beat, but the Niners lost their quarterback, actually their third-string quarterback in that game. And it didn't work. The best team at full strength that Philly beat all year was the Detroit Lions in week 1. When they played Dallas had Cooper Rush. When, they got through last year's NFC without really playing a good team. This year they beat Buffalo. They went to Kansas City and beat Kansas City. They beat Dallas at home in a really hard-fought game. This team is like battle-tested. It sort of reminds me of the Chiefs just a couple years ago where, the Chiefs had like 6 road wins against teams with 10 wins or more. And it's just like, once you get into that groove, you're kind of like, no game is too big, right? And I do think that over time, that really helps you. In New England, it was, beating the Steelers. It was beating the Colts. It was beating some of those other teams. And, there was an aura that you guys had where it was like, we're not losing to the Colts. We're not losing to the Steelers. And I think that the Eagles kind of have that. And I know it's not analytical and I know it's kind of like hand wavy, but I think that the Eagles have that going right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, we're watching it down the stretch, right? You're exactly right. Down the stretch, Kelsey gets charged with 2 penalties, right? 2 procedures? It was 2, wasn't it? And then he comes around, he's like, MF, I'm going to smack the living crap out of this guy. Pulls around, he's putting his ass on the line. Swift does what he needs to do to get around the corner. Hurts is running the ball when he needs to run it. They're doing whatever. I'm watching Julio out on the other side there, actually trying to block a little bit, which brought back memories a little bit. The receivers are kicking butt. I just there's something about that team that just seems like they're just in such a groove right now. And to your point, they have a toughness, that Super Bowl DNA that people talk about, that, who knows if they do have that, but the reality is it's a tough team. Even my receiver buddy there, number 13, he's catching in the back, right? I'm like, oh man, I was so happy for him. He's down the line receiver for them, right? Is he their number 4?
Olamide Zaccheaus?
Yeah, I think he's number 4 for
Your
them.
guy, right? Yeah. No, he had a touchdown in that game.
Yeah,
It was great. Yeah, like and to your point, like AJ Brown, who has had one of the best seasons in the league, he's already over 1,000 yards, was basically neutralized yesterday. It was Devontae Smith, your guy Olamide Zaccheaus. Those guys, like they basically stepped. Like it's what you're saying. It's championship football, right? When Lane Johnson is out, the right tackle takes over and does well. When the Bills put a lot of attention to AJ Brown, it's Devontae Smith. Dallas Goedert's out for the season with a broken arm, right? The tight end, they don't really miss him much. Amy has a good comment here. Broncos, baby. Okay, that one we have to talk about at some point. Now that they're on a 5-game win streak, and I know you have some Colorado roots. Let's talk lastly though about this game. I know we're running out of time, but I really do want to talk about this. Houston hosts Jacksonville. Jacksonville's a short favorite. That was fun. I'm watching CJ Stroud, and he is such an aesthetically pleasing quarterback to watch. When you see him go from decision to release, it's the fastest thing I've seen in the league. He's just got such this really quick, like, I hate to say this because, he's a top 5 quarterback of all time for me, but like it kind of looks Marino-like when he throws the football. And I watch him and how resilient he is, but with so many injuries on that team and an offensive line that's not all that great and wide receivers that none of us have heard of before this year. And he's just out there dealing. And then, of course, you look at the other side. It's Trevor Lawrence. Yep. It's your guy, Calvin Ridley, basically shut out in the first half, gets 70 yards and a touchdown or so in the second half. That team and their defense, Foye Oluokun making plays all season. And I watched that game, and I'm thinking to myself, 2 years ago, this was the worst game in the league. Jaguars, Texans. And now it's the best game of the weekend. And I'm thinking, like, that is so cool. And that is the promise of analytics. That's the promise of drafting quarterbacks. That's the promise of Sumer. That's the promise of roster building. It's like all these teams in the league. We just got done talking for 20 minutes about the Panthers and how down and out it looks and all this kind of stuff. And we were talking that way about Houston 2 years ago. We were talking that way about Jacksonville 3 years ago. And now they're playing in a meaningful game for that division. And both quarterbacks look amazing. Both coaches look like they have the thing figured out. Both, general manager, like that whole, and that, I think that game, it makes me happy because I think when you look around the 32 leagues and their fan bases, teams and the fan bases, I think that's the hope for the rest of the teams in the league is that game.
So, I mean, you have 2 general managers who are doing a heck of a job. I mean, Trent Baalke and, of course, Nick Cassero. And Nick and his head coach, when you think about that, they have to be in line. I know it's early still, but they have to be in line for executive and COY, right? I mean, if they continue to do what they're doing. I hate to think that I don't like getting ahead of myself on that because I think you never know, right? Who's the team that's truly going to be worthy of being coach of the year and executive of the year? Who else is out there, by the way? I don't mean to protract, but what other teams truly could be considered a turnaround coach of the year, executive of the year?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, they lost yesterday and it wasn't pretty. But I think you have to give consideration to Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland because no quarterback. Quarterback's been hurt or ineffective for most of the year, and they're still competitive. Now, yesterday, the wheels kind of fell off. I think that you have to consider. Now, remember when Frank Reich, when he was first with the Colts, they started 1-5 and then won a playoff game. Yeah. You're getting to a similar trajectory for Sean Payton in Denver, 1-5 to 6-5. In the thick of it. So I think Peyton deserves a little bit of credit. I mean, he's fooling us all into thinking Russell Wilson still has a chance to be a good quarterback. Here's a sneaky one. And somebody said Steichen. I agree. I think the Colts are a phenomenal story. Last year, they were giving up a 33-point lead to Kirk Cousins. And now, they're above 500 and in the thick of things in the AFC South. You might get 3 playoff teams out of that division, Colts, Texans, and Jags. If some of these teams don't get their act together. But here's one that I want to throw out there because we just saw them on Thanksgiving. They have a really easy schedule moving forward, and that quarterback looks like he's figured some things out. Matt LaFleur of Green Bay.
Wow. Okay, well, he's turning the corner. I know they're excited about him. I'm not buying that one yet. No offense to Matt and Brian Goodikins, but look, you never know. You're exactly right. When they start putting that all together and they start deciding who turned it around with the odds against them, which is ultimately how they have to look at it. And remember, everyone, there's a coach of the year and an executive of the year that's picked by the media. Don't really care about that. Sorry, media. Meaning, as a GM and a head coach, you care about your peers. That's the sporting news. You do care about that, and that's not just speaking from my experience. Like, that is something that we care about, right? You want to be recognized by your peers. Your owner, you want your owner to look at that and say, look, we've invested in the right head coach, and we're doing the right things with the players as far as the team build. So anyway, I don't mean to again protract on that, but it is an interesting conversation because a lot of people are talking about what's going down in Houston, even though they lost. Where are they in all of that voting?
Yeah, I think they deserve some credit for sure. I think a lot of people are going to look at Stroud and because that award, generally speaking, now we have had a situation where in 2019, John Harbaugh won Coach of the Year and Lamar Jackson won MVP. But to the point is, Andy Reid hasn't been in Coach of the Year contention forever. And a lot of that is because his quarterback is really good. And so it often, to your point, is not necessarily an award about who is the best coach. It's the coach who's taken the least and done the most with it. Brian Daboll last year with the Giants being a clear example of going 9-7 with Daniel Jones. That's generally how the award is doled out. But it's it's not an award about who's the best. I'll just say that. It's an award about who's done the best relative to expectations. And I think when you look at like a team like the Colts, that's got to be one. Ballard, for example, is really on the hot seat that, at times. And I think that his seat is firmly cooled down given how they've rebuilt that team. And he's made some tough decisions. He obviously had to get rid of Shaq Leonard, formerly known as Darius Leonard, because he didn't fit in the defense anymore. And there are tough decisions that he's made, and good on the Colts for sticking with him because it's clear that he has the goods there now that and that's with a backup quarterback that they're going 6-5 right now, Indianapolis. So there's a lot of good candidates. And it's fun. It's sort of it's pretty fun to watch out there. So I'm excited about that. Before we go, there's another coach that I think deserves Coach of the Year, and they coach tonight.
Huh.
Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings head coach, deserves consideration. He's very good in game. If you watch the games tonight, notice how they manipulate the clock. Notice how they don't mess around with timeouts. Notice how he goes to the right fourth downs. But also, notice how he's empowered Josh Dobbs, a guy who's been there for less than a month, to play quarterback for him. He's a very good coach as well. And I think if the Vikings end up making the playoffs or even sneaking into that division title, they have 2 more games left with Detroit. I think he's going to get consideration as well. And it's crazy that he didn't get consideration last year when he took the Vikings to 13 wins after previously 8 the season before. But he's a guy that I think deserves some consideration as well. And I'm interested to see how they play tonight.
So with that being the case, do you think Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah belongs in the Executive of the Year, EOY consideration?
So it's going to be hard. So yes, but I think it's going to be hard to get over the draft he had last year where Lewis Seen doesn't even dress on game days anymore, his first round pick. They traded away the Jameson Williams pick, who's Jameson Williams coming on a little bit. That whole draft is kind of a dud. But I will say this about Kwesi, and I think this is where kind of we talked about at the beginning of the broadcast with the finance guys. They write off bad bets quickly. Kwesi, I think a lot of people, if they drafted a safety in the first round and he wasn't getting it, right? They would still try to play him to salvage the pick.
Yeah.
The Vikings have mostly just written off every bad pick and just kept going, right? And kept making moves, trading for Hawkinson, trading for Cam Akers, trading for Josh Dobbs. I think Kwesi's biggest strength is kind of like the memoryless part of it, which is to say making moves that are great moving forward, not exactly buying into sunk costs and just keeping on churning. I think that's his biggest strength. I think he'll be in consideration, but I don't think he'll win it unless they don't lose a game the rest of the year. But it's a good question. The Minnesota, I think, is onto some things. I'm optimistic for them.
I knew you were bringing them up. We weren't going to get out of the day without it. So thank you for proving me right.
I have to deliver on the predictability part of this whole thing. So this has been fun. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for all the great comments. We hope that you will hit the like button, hit the subscribe button you haven't already. Tell somebody about this show. Tell everybody how great of insights and how unique this is. You're never going to get a podcast with a former GM who's talking as I would say openly and insightfully as Thomas does on this show. So hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, tell somebody that you care about this show. And when we hit it big, you can tell everybody you were here first. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.